Hello, my name is Charlie Miller, and I'm here interviewing Leo Anderson. Today's date is August 15th, 2022, and we're interviewing via Zoom. And I'm a volunteer at the Library of Congress working on the Veterans History Project. I first want to ask you some biographical information, like your date and place of birth.
Sure. So I was born November 16th, 1986 in Newark, Ohio.
Awesome. And what were the names of your parents and their occupations? And if they served in the military, what branch did they serve in?
My parents were Michael and Carla Anderson. Michael was an engineer and Carla was a baker. Neither of them served in the military.
Cool. What schooling did you have before entering the military?
So I joined after I got my bachelor's degree. So I graduated from Newark High in 2005. Then I went to Ashland University, where I was a part of the Ashford Scholar Program, got a bachelor's of arts degree, major in international studies with minors in political science and history. And then I attended officer candidate school after I graduated.
All right. And do you remember exactly where you enlisted and what branch you chose, and I guess like your reasoning behind it?
Sure. So I originally worked through an enlisted recruiter there in Newark, Ohio, then decided to go to college first and then become an officer later on. So I ended up actually signing to go to OCS. So as an officer, you don't really enlist, you get a commission. And once you're offered the commission, you accept or decline that. But I signed to go to OCS through the Officer Selection Office in Kent, Ohio, near Kent State University. I did a lot of discernment before college as to what branch I wanted to join. I decided to join the military to find some purpose as a teenager, and then later on while I was in college, and I wanted to start my career in whatever I was going to do with military service. So it being young and idealistic, I found the Marines, and I had some family members in the Marines, but I had family members in a lot of different branches of the service. But something in the Marine Corps just really spoke to me that time in my life. So I went full on toward the Marine Corps once I got into college, and through a couple of little administrative hiccups, ended up having to wait until after graduation to start OCS. But then, I think it was the October after graduation, I shipped off to Quantico, Virginia to start officer candidate school.
And what were your parents and family members' thoughts of you joining the Marines?
I mean, obviously they were worried because it was, I think I graduated in 2009. So the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan were still very hot. And I had joined under a reserve contract that guaranteed me a spot in a deploying unit that would be going over pretty soon. So they knew what the future had in store, and they were obviously worried, but we'd had a lot of family history in the military. So they knew that at a certain point you feel a sense of duty, and when you have to go, you have to go. So they were incredibly supportive and are to this day. And I'm lucky for that because they held back a lot of emotions and a lot of their feelings of fear and apprehension to be supportive of that.
Yeah, that's great. Do you want to talk a little bit about kind of your initial impressions on training in Virginia, and I guess if there were any culture shocks or like what were the initial differences from everyday life, I guess?
Sure. So the one thing I noticed first and foremost was for a lot of college educated adults, when you put people in that sort of situation, like a boot camp style or an OCS style situation, everyone starts acting like children really quickly. So it was, we don't know how to think for ourselves or act for ourselves anymore because of the culture we've been indoctrinated into, because of the drill instructors and the adherence to protocol and things like that. And it was a rough transition for us, but it was even a rougher transition for the prior enlisted Marines who were in our platoon. So at OCS, it was a lot of recent college grads and then a lot of previously enlisted Marines who had gone and gotten their degrees and now wanted to become officers. So I had in my platoon a couple of staff sergeants, a gunnery sergeant, several E5 sergeants who had spent a career in the Marine Corps already and were being treated like recruits again. So that was a rough transition for them. And I think it was even rougher on them than it was on us who'd had no exposure to it. So the guys who had really kind of earned the right to be Marines, earned that respect already, were tossed back into that boot camp style environment with us. So as rough as we had it coming out of college, they were much more frustrated.
Yeah, what was kind of that moment where you kind of realized like, oh, this is getting real, and you just had to set your head down and kind of dig deep for inner strength?
That would have been the first night after pickup. So at boot camp, they call it Black Friday. At OCS, they called it pickup at the time, where for the first few days, you're being run around to different administrative stops by enlisted members of the staff at the school. And while they're not the nicest folks in the world in that environment, I'm sure they're perfectly great people outside of it, but they weren't drill instructors. And the day you actually meet your drill instructors is called pickup. And it is just a feeding frenzy of second tour and third tour experienced drill instructors, guys who had already done their tours on the drill fields in Paris Island and San Diego, who are back for the opportunity to do it all again and to do it to a next generation of officers. So the just madness and fury of drill instructors all concentrated into the course of a couple of hours. So we leave the auditorium where we get picked up, and our drill instructors are screaming at us the entire way, and they take us back to the squad bays, and they're running us through all these, these exercises that they'd tested and tried and become protocol for years. But for us, it was just this sort of terrible nightmare that was happening to us at the moment. And the way every day ends is you stand in interior guard. So someone is awake, standing up at a post while everyone else is asleep. And because of the advantage of having a name with an A in it, I was the very first one to stand fire watch, which meant while everyone else was supposed to be asleep, I was the only one that all the drill instructors could mess with and yell at. So I got about a 1 or 2 hour shift of just being tormented by all these drill instructors. And it was a real rough awakening. And I had played sports growing up, and I had played football in high school, and I had gotten used to being yelled at by coaches. But over the course of 4 years in college, that edge sort of went away, and I got used to people not yelling at me or getting in my face. And it all came back really rough, really quickly. So that, I would say, the real transition point for me where it all really hit home that this is a very different situation was that night on fire watch.
Yeah, that sounds intense. Yeah, wow. Do you want to talk, I guess, about how you progressed through camp? I know you were doing some basic training in Virginia, but did you go to like a specialist school before going overseas, or did you just immediately after training go overseas?
Sure. So our process at the time in the Marine Corps was once you commission through whatever commissioning source you use, whether it's ROTC, the Naval Academy, or OCS like I did, that is more of your screening process. So we spent 10 weeks in the squad bay getting shouted at by drill instructors. And really the point of that school wasn't to teach us much or to develop us as new officers. It was to screen out for any perceived weaknesses and things they decided would disqualify us from being good at the job. So after that 10 weeks, we commission as officers, we get our rank as second lieutenants, and we get handed the Eagle Globe and Anchor by our drill instructors to make us full-fledged Marines. And we get shipped off to the basic school, which is on that same base there in Quantico, Virginia. The basic school, specifically the basic officer leadership course, the basic officer course, the Army calls it. Called basic officer course. Everyone just refers to it as TBS, even though TBS houses several different schools, 2 of which I got to go to while I was there. But they ship us off to TBS for the basic officer course, and that's 6 months of crash course learning everything you need to do to be an officer. So it's not with the drill instructors anymore. Most of your instructors are captains or majors, and it's learning everything from administration to logistics to basic infantry tactics. And it's really the basis of how to lead Marines without your specific military occupational specialty training. Part of that 6-month school is also your discernment process and selection process for what your MOS is going to be. I was one of the lucky ones who got infantry. Thankfully, my SPC, or staff platoon commander, the captain who was in charge of our platoon, decided he wanted me to be an infantry officer early on. So even later on, when I started to lose faith in that plan myself, he was pretty adamant that that was what I was going to do. So at the end of that 6 months, actually 2 days before I graduated from that school, I ran the indoctrination screening test for infantry officer course. And the infantry officer course, for me at least, began immediately following the basic officer course. So I'd spent, while it's still housed under TBS, it's referred to as something different as IOC. So by the time I was done in IOC, which was another 3 months, I'd spent 1 week short of a full year in Quantico, Virginia, straight in training.
And in Quantico, what were some of the, I guess, basic training necessities that an infantryman would need?
So when you say basic, the basic infantryman necessities are really taught at the schools of the infantry for the enlisted side. And IOC really prides itself in being an advanced infantry course because they want to drop us off in our new units. Like my story specifically, I got dropped off in a unit full of combat veterans who had just gotten back from Afghanistan. And they know that they're dropping off a 23-year-old untested officer to be in charge of up to 40, 50 people at any given time. So they want to make sure you are at least academically and mentally ready for that. So they teach us all the best, newest tactics, techniques, and procedures, and also how to train those TTPs, how to teach and mentor and coach the people who are under your command, how to integrate yourself into that already established culture, and how to influence that culture from your point. So it was a lot of advanced fire controls. So you learned how to control fires from different agencies. So I could have mortars firing, another section of mortars firing from somewhere else, artillery firing, planes going overhead, helicopters involved in the mix. And I could organize that sort of violent symphony by radio calls or by delegation of authorities to different people. So fires was a big thing. We learned a lot of the human factors of combat. So how to drive people toward what would be their physical breaking point and to overcome some of the mental barriers that usually your mind puts in place before you reach that physical breaking point. So you could really stretch someone's capabilities to the fullest extent possible. We learned a lot of military history, a lot of more advanced infantry tactics and integration with different things like armored personnel carriers, integration with tanks. We even did one really cool package in our final exercise out in 29 Palms. They flew us out there for a lot of things that we just couldn't do in Virginia. At one point, we were in a simulated Afghan village, and we were there with, I think, 200 some Afghan immigrant role players. So they were Afghans who had moved to the United States and immigrated over here, but they came back and helped out the U.S. military by acting as role players. And they would fill roles in the city from like regular innocent civilians to enemy combatants to the local national police to Afghan National Army representatives. And we learned how to work within that structure and how we would run a sort of small war operation with local indigenous forces and a local population who would not speak English the whole time we were there. So we had to really quickly understand, like, here is your interpreter. Here's how to use an interpreter properly. Here's how to work with the local population who are distrustful of you already because you don't even speak the same language. So things to that level of advancement were offered in IOC. And that was the only reason any of us were close to comfortable going out and taking over our units afterwards.
Wow. Very interesting. Did you have any other training before you were sent to the Middle East, or did you go after Quantico?
So I never deployed to the Middle East. My deployments were all as a military advisor to different places around the world. But every unit within the U.S. military is constantly training. So you're constantly doing exercises and developing your training regimen, and you've got these annual training requirements you have to hit so that you're sure that not only you, but all the Marines under your command and all the equipment that you have are ready to go at a moment's notice. So my first training exercise was in Senegal. Shortly after I got to my unit in the summer 2012, we went over to Senegal as part of what they called Operation Western Accord, which is an exercise between the U.S. and the Economic Community of West African States, ECOWAS. So we worked with Marines and soldiers from the Gambia, Senegal, Burkina Faso, and Guinea, and one other that doesn't come to mind right now. But it was a really cool opportunity to not only go and work with foreign counterparts, which I had done some study abroad while I was in college, so I was used to working overseas a little bit. And to get to do that again was really exciting. But it was also a really good opportunity to spend 2 weeks out in some far-flung desert with my platoon that I was in command of at the time, and really just get to know one another, start building those cultures and dynamics that made us a more effective unit. But after that, it was a constant flurry of, I'd gotten stationed with a reserve unit. So it was once a month out in the field, running some sort of exercise, whether it's basic marksmanship or combined arms movement, where we're calling in simulated airstrikes, or at times, real airstrikes with inert rounds, judging artillery and mortar fires, and exercising our command and control of different assets on the battle space. It was once a month. And then in the summertime, there was always a big 2-week exercise, whether it was that 1 year in Senegal, or 1 year up in the mountains in Bridgeport, California, doing mountain warfare training, or out in 29 Palms doing large combined fire exercises where we were working with armored personnel carriers, tanks, artillery, helicopters, the whole gambit of what the Marine Corps had to bring to bear. We had to practice and qualify working with all of it. So in a reserve unit, you can imagine trying to do all that when all you have to work with is 1 weekend a month and then 2 weeks in the summer. It's a pretty tight schedule. So we got a lot of training in, but it was always a bit rushed.
And when you're working on these various training exercises in places like Senegal and other international countries, are you working hand in hand with the local military? And was there ever language barriers, or what was kind of the teamwork dynamic like when working with other militaries?
Absolutely. And it's a tough question to put a singular answer on, because I worked with a lot of different foreign militaries during my time in the Marines, and every one of them was unique and had its own special challenges. But obviously some were better than others. Some countries and cultures put a lot more emphasis on their military, and others it's kind of an afterthought. It's kind of something you do as a conscript when you're younger, and you don't really care that much about it until there's an actual war. And some countries, they are absolute professional soldiers that would give anyone in the U.S. military a run for their money. When I was working with the Mexican Marines, they were the first force I'd ever worked with where I said, right now, if they said, hey, we've got a mission to go on, do you want to jump in the truck with us? I'd hop in the truck right now, to this day, because they were incredible. There were some forces where I said, okay, these guys would make me kind of uneasy to work with them. And there were some forces where you talk to them about their attitudes toward the civilian population in their countries, their attitudes toward even their neighbors in adjacent countries. And it makes you kind of nervous, because you realize the culture of that military has led to something that could very easily become an oppressive kind of relationship. And in some of those countries, we saw coup d'etats happen within a few years of working with them. That's the real risk of working with foreign militaries, is you don't know what's going to happen with them in the future. I've seen several countries that I've worked with directly have military overthrows of their government. It's sad to see.
And are you usually drawn in those situations because there's a conflict, or is it more like a multi-country geopolitical, or can you describe like how does a situation evolve where kind of multi militaries are working together?
Sure. So the United States is very into a concept called security cooperation, where we realize that way better than going and trying to be everywhere in the world is to try to export our military culture and prowess to our neighbors. So, for instance, we worked with the countries of the ECOWAS, the Economic Community of West African States, and we wanted to make sure that the United States was seen as a partner there that could provide training and advice and equipment for them to fight wars that they were finding themselves in. Specifically at the time, in Libya, the government had just been overthrown, and the forces of Omar Gaddafi were now spreading out over what was called the Trans-Sahel. And there were some Tuareg separatists who were causing a lot of trouble in Mali, and a lot of these guys in the Economic Community of West African States knew they were going to have to engage with those Malian separatists very soon afterwards. So the United States, they took an exercise they had been doing with some of their friendly partner forces in the ECOWAS for years, and the ECOWAS looked at that as, okay, well, we can use this as sort of a pre-deployment training, make sure everybody's got that last bit of preparation before we go into battle. And shortly after that, they went in and they dealt with the Malian separatists as part of a United Nations mission. And some of them are still there to this day. I've got a good friend who is a Ghanaian officer who goes up to the border every once in a while. But unfortunately, some of the forces that we worked with were put in a situation where they felt they had to overthrow their government. So Burkina Faso ended up having a coup d'etat shortly after that happened, the couple of years following. So I would say it's not like we target a certain part of the world that is in upheaval right now, but the United States likes to cast a wide net and make sure we have as many friends and partners in the international scene as we can.
What were some of your like typical free time activities when you were, doing international service? Were you ever able to go and actually see the culture of the countries, or was it mostly being on base and stuff?
Yeah, so I got really lucky in that because I didn't deploy to somewhere like Afghanistan or Iraq, the places where I did deploy had what we call a Liberty package. So, for instance, when I was in the Republic of Georgia, we were there training a Georgian Light Infantry Battalion to go to Afghanistan and provide security around Bagram Airfield. That meant that during the week, I was training Georgian soldiers, hand in hand between a cadre of American trainers and a cadre of Georgian trainers. We would train the battalion during the week, and then usually there's little, if any, training on the weekend. So I would go out with some Georgian or some American troops, and we'd go out into Tbilisi, Georgia, and we'd just have the weekend to ourselves. We'd have contracted drivers who were security vetted, and they did everything they could between the embassy security and the Georgian military security and our own team's internal security to make sure we were very safe when we were going out. But we got to have kind of the run of the town. We got to see the Eastern Europe for what it was, spend weekends up skiing. We went to Godori to ski. Some of the best skiing I've ever done was there in Eastern Europe. We got to take some leave. So me and some friends went to Prague and Budapest and got to see a lot of Europe on leave. Did an exercise in Germany where we were doing a final qualification test for the Georgian battalion. And after we were done with our final qualification there in Germany at the Hohenfels U.S. Army base there, the Marine Corps Association Foundation actually funded my team to go and visit the old Marine Corps battlefield from World War I at Belleau Wood in France. So we did a day of visiting Paris, and then the next day we went and visited the battlefield at Belleau Wood. I got to see a big piece of Marine Corps history that a lot of people don't see. And then further on, when I was working in Mexico, I got to spend a lot of time out in places like Campeche and Merida and really get a feel for Mexican culture, make friends down in Mexico, make connections that I still hold to this day. And that's been a really important part. Since I did most of my work as a military advisor, I would say that was really the coolest part of the job, was getting to go and travel the world and really see it, not have to sit on a base somewhere and just, experience the Americans around you. I actually got to go out and experience a lot of the countries that we got to visit.
Yeah, that's really remarkable that we're able to do that for our troops. I never knew that.
And that all depends on where you go and what your job is. Like if you're in a place where the security situation is worse, obviously you don't get to go out and experience that. But I was lucky enough that the place I deployed, even when I was in Mexico, and Mexico was a relatively dangerous country at the time, I was in a very safe part of it. So my Marines and I were able to go out, and especially when we were out with our Mexican counterparts, they made sure that we ended up in places where we'd be safe, where we didn't have to worry about any narcotic violence happening. It was a good setup.
Cool. And just to get like a timeline going, how long were you exactly running these various training exercises?
Let's see. So I did by the time I got out, it was about 10 years. So the first 5, I would say, I was just in the reserves. So Senegal was the only time I went overseas in those first 5 years. It wasn't until 2016 where I deployed over to the Republic of Georgia as an advisor there. Came back, spent 3 months back at my private sector job in logistics, and then got an opportunity to deploy to Mexico after that. And then after Mexico, I came back and received a set of orders to Marine Forces South, that at the time was co-located with Southcom in Doral, Florida. It's right outside of Miami. And I was working as an operations planner for exercises and operations going on in South and Central America and the Caribbean. So it was about the last 5, and I did a lot of traveling there as well. So it was about the last 5 years where I was really moving around a lot. In the first 5, I went to Senegal, but then it was mostly domestic training around the United States.
And was there ever really a threat of you having to, go into combat, or did you feel pretty secure in your position that you were just mainly going to be doing routine stuff?
No, I applied to go to combat a couple of times. And the rough part was when I was recruited, I was told if you take a reserve contract, they're deploying all of these reserve battalions without any junior officers. So not only are we going to put you with the battalion that's going, but you'll have the opportunity to go with another battalion after that or another battalion after that. So realistically, while you're on a reserve contract, you're probably going to spend the most of your first few years deployed. And the day I graduated IOC, we had already gotten word that they were offering bonuses for people who were willing to jump on with the battalion that was going over in a few months. And they were talking about bonuses to encourage junior officers to jump on with the battalion going a few months after that. And really, we were just looking at, do I want to go right now, having just finished a year of training, or do I want to take some time with my family and go on the next one? And all the reserve contracts in my IOC class were having a lot of conversations about this. Are you going to go on this one? Are you going to wait and go on the next one? Do you want to wait and go with your home unit that they're sending you to and take their slot in the order so much? And the day we graduated, a colonel from the reserves gathered us all up and said, "Hey, I got some bad news for you. The 2 workups we have in progress right now to go to Afghanistan are canceled. Marine Corps just decided this week we're done sending reserve infantry battalions over to Afghanistan because we're now in the phase of the war where we're pulling out." That was 2011. So while I got to hear a lot of cool stories from my friends who are on active duty contracts who deployed in the months and the years following that during our pull down, like our drawdown actions, the reserves stopped deploying. So it was, you could deploy as a reservist as an individual mobilization augmentee, which meant you took a singular spot that needed someone. So because there are these thousands of reservists who want these spots, it got extremely competitive. And for me, the answer I kept getting was, well, we don't want someone who doesn't have any experience. We want to give the spot to someone with more experience. But the only way you're getting that experience is if you go to Afghanistan. So it was kind of a catch-22. And of course, as like a young, very gung-ho Marine who spent years trying to get into OCS and then spent a whole year training in Quantico to get this job, your whole ambition is to go out and lead troops in combat. So like you can read these stories from new young officers since the dawn of time, where you realize that you're getting in right as the war is ending, and everyone is trying to rush to get their spot in the war and make sure they make their mark. So for me and a lot of my colleagues at the time, it was a really kind of rough thing to come to terms with, that we did all this work to get into this war, and we're going to be the ones who never got to go. But then eventually you come to the realization, and everybody kind of comes to this point in a different way, that, if the worst thing that happened to you is nobody ever tried to shoot at you, you never had to do with anything like shoot someone else, and nobody ever tried to kill the people you really care about, there's really nothing to complain about. So while that youthful zeal makes you want to like, oh, I have to get in, I have to go to combat, when you get a couple more years experience under your belt, you realize like, okay, maybe it's not the worst thing. Like I tried my best to try to get in there, but the fact that I didn't go isn't really anything to be sad about.
It's really interesting. And so that timing was, I think you said 2012, is that right?
Yeah, so it was 2000, like the very last couple of months of 2011 that I graduated. So it would have been 2012 when they were talking about canceling the deployments.
And then I'm just kind of putting that in context to how long the involvement of the U.S. government, right, in Afghanistan was. Did part of you in the back of your mind think, like, oh gosh, Afghanistan is such a complex place, there probably will be a need for me at some point? I mean, given that we only really got, final out until 2021. Just curious around that idea.
No, so the rhetoric at the time was very clear that we were pulling out, that our involvement with Afghanistan was over. And based on what we had seen in Iraq, the accelerated withdrawal from Iraq was pretty quick and pretty drastic. So at the time, we all kind of expected this was it for Afghanistan. And even in a couple of years following, I had friends who were going in and they were deploying as artillery observers, watching them tear down the forward operating bases that I had heard stories from the Marines who served under me that they had just built the year before. So for a long time, it was all signals were pointing to, we're pulling out, we're pulling out, we're pulling out. But that we're pulling out phase lasted another 8 years.
Yeah. And so you did training, you said, for about 10 years. And when did your 10-year mark end?
Let's see. So I think I signed my contract 2010. So it would have ended 2020. 2020, I was at Marine Forces South down in Miami, and COVID had hit. And I had kind of decided that, even before that, I decided I wanted to go to graduate school and pursue an MBA and move on with my life and do something besides the Marine Corps. And COVID kind of hit at in both an opportune and inopportune time, because I'd gotten a couple of cool sounding missions tossed on my plate. Like, you can go do this, you do that. Some neat counter narcotics stuff that I was getting involved with. But at the time it was, look, COVID's happening, so everything's canceled, but grad school is still happening. So it made a lot of sense. Like, okay, this is the sign, like it's time to turn it in here and move on to the next part of life. So it was about that 10-year mark where I got accepted into Notre Dame and headed up there for the MBA program. Yep, exactly.
Nice. Congratulations. And so that's 2 years, right? In MBA?
Yep.
All right. And so what was your final rank when you left the military?
So while I was still down at Marine Forces South, I was selected for major. And since I was a reservist to begin with, and when I left that position, I ended up in the individual ready reserve, the IRR. So it was January 1st of that next year that I was officially promoted to major, but I was very much fully into grad school at that point. So while I left as a major, I never put the uniform on. So I would while on paper I was a major, I would say the last work I did in the Marine Corps as a captain.
And you're in business. Have you graduated business school? Or are you still in business school?
Yep. Graduated in May, and I now work for GE Aerospace is the new tagline. So it used to be GE Aviation. I'm working in GE Aerospace in a program they call the Military Officer Leadership Program. So it's a leadership development or management development program. Different companies have different terms for it, but it's a rotational training program for new senior level managers to give you experience in different aspects of the business. And then after 2 years, you apply for and get shuffled into a senior level management position somewhere in GE Aerospace. Specifically for me, I'm the first one going through in the additive manufacturing branch. So I'll do some rotations around the additive manufacturing business there, GE Additive. And after 2 years, I'll find a place that suits me and start working there.
And do you plan to stay involved with Veterans Affairs? I don't know if you already are, but somewhere down the line with an organization or volunteer work, do you plan on doing that?
Absolutely. I've always been a big believer in vets organizations as like social aspects. And my grandfather's generation had the American Legion and the VFW and organizations like that. Those kind of fell out of fashion. No one really joins anymore at the levels that they used to. And I think we're missing something there. So you see a lot of the issues with veteran suicide and veteran depression, things like that are very much tied to, more often than not. Now, every situation is unique, but more often than not, they're tied to feelings of isolation, where you are surrounded by people. You feel like even if they're talking to you, they don't get it. You can't really share your stories. You can't share some vulnerabilities in a way that you feel like you can get support for it. And a lot of veterans have a lot of trouble transitioning because they don't get support from people who've also been there. And I think those organizations really lend a lot of that missing piece for veterans transitioning. So in the near future, I plan to be involved with some organizations like that.
I'd love to hear a little bit about kind of your choice to go to Notre Dame, obviously given the ROTC history, and Notre Dame's always, I think, had a close relationship with the military. Did that factor in at all to your selection for graduate school?
So even closer than that relationship, my cousin was an Army officer who was finishing up his MBA at Notre Dame when I was applying to mine. And I had gotten it in my head, like, no, I'm going to one of the internationally recognized M7 MBA programs. I'm going to Wharton, or I'm going to London Business School, or I'm going to Ross. And after the first couple of those rejected me and were very adamant that I not go to school there, I had a very honest conversation with my cousin TJ, and he convinced me that Notre Dame was probably the place I should end up based on the culture there, the fact that Notre Dame, growing up Irish Catholic in the Midwest, Notre Dame's always going to hold a special place in your heart. And he kind of leveraged that to me and convinced me that, okay, just send me your package. I'll make sure it all looks the way Notre Dame wants it to look, and you'll get your interviews and you'll do fine in the interviews. But he retooled my resume and my application PowerPoint slides that you had to turn in, and really was that deciding factor to convince me to go to Notre Dame. And I'm really happy he did. And he brings it up all the time. And I have to give him the credit for that. But yeah, thankfully he did, because I don't know if I'd have been as happy and fulfilled at another school, honestly, because realistically, the Veterans Network there at Notre Dame is an incredibly supportive community, especially for people that are transitioning out. I had the opportunity to transition out of the military 3 or 4 times. Because the way the reserves works, I would spend a year on active duty and then back in the reserves where I'm working a regular job and around regular folks. So I got to not only experience that hardship of transitioning a bunch of times, I got to watch a lot of people transition, watch a lot of the ways people succeeded and failed at transitioning. And I can say that Notre Dame, especially the Vets Club we had there at Mendoza for the MBA program, incredibly supportive community for transitioning veterans. And I think those people up there did an incredibly good job at making sure we had the things we needed to succeed.
Great. One other topic I'd love to cover, just I think you had mentioned it in kind of the pre-call or prep call that we had done about how you had two grandfathers, I think on either side of your family. And you talked about one story, and I don't know if it was your grandfather, if it was your uncle who found a family member. It was a great story. I was wondering if that's a story you feel comfortable sharing with for the archive, just because it seemed pretty incredible.
Sure. So the reason I really wanted to do this, and I get a little bit emotional when I talk about this, is because both of my grandfathers served in World War II. One, from what we can tell from the stories that have survived, he had applied to be a pilot, and because of needs of the Army at the time and where he was in the training pipeline, lost his seat in pilot school and became a radio operator with a frontline infantry unit as part of Patton's Third Army, and ended up in Europe in that final push where they were liberating death camps and things like that, and saw a lot of really harsh action. Now, when he got back, he turned to the transition assistance that a lot of veterans at the time did, which was alcoholism. So he and a lot of other vets at the time just decided to not talk about the things that they had seen and not talk about the issues they were having, and just turn to the bottle. So we lost a lot of that history. We lost a lot of our families involved in that. We lost a lot more than that in the years of alcoholism that he had experienced. Eventually, he found Alcoholics Anonymous and got clean. The family did a lot better after that. But on the other side, my grandfather, on my maternal side, Harry Zuber, deployed to World War II after 1945 as part of what he called the repopulation force, where he was a part of the kind of police action and occupation that happened after the shots had been fired. So he got there, and he was involved with one tense standoff with the Russians, where there was a captured Russian or German boat, I think, at one point, and he was standing guard on a train track, this train bridge. And at one point, his lieutenant and staff sergeant swing by and give him a couple extra magazines for his M1 carbine and a helmet. They're like, "Look, the Russians may try to come across this bridge and seize this thing we're guarding. So if that happens, we've got a plane circling overhead and they're going to bomb the bridge, but do your best." And this is, little Harry Zuber from Olney, Illinois. He's, what am I supposed to do with an M1 carbine against the Russians? So thankfully nothing happened, but he always took it upon himself to make sure he was the voice for his two brothers who did see a lot of combat. And at one point he handed me a sheaf of papers where his brother had written down his story, and the story of how he had been advancing through Europe at one point with his unit, and they came across the bodies of American troops along the side of the road where a unit had been in pretty heavy combat, and the bodies were waiting there to be picked up. But he knew his brother's unit had been in the same area. So he starts going through and pulling up bodies, trying to see if it's his brother. And he looks down the road and he realizes there's no way he's ever going to check all these bodies. He's going to drive himself insane trying to. And I think it was months later that he finally got word from his brother that he was okay. But he was walking around Europe with that sinking feeling like that was probably my brother there in those piles of bodies. So my grandfather, Harry, actually did a lot of work. He went on the honor flights back when they were having those, to fly to DC to see the World War II memorial. And he did a lot of work in the American Legion to make sure his brother's stories were told.
Wow, that's amazing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
That's amazing. Maybe you can share just, I feel like Leo might be interested about who you met this weekend.
Oh, yeah. My grandmother, we were visiting her this weekend, got me in contact with a female Marine that served during World War II. She was often involved with transcribing stuff and doing radio, in the United States during the World War II conflict. It was really interesting to hear her stories from a perspective where women weren't really, valued in times of war and in the military. And
Yeah.
it's all the hardship she had to experience because of her being a woman.
But
Yeah.
tell them how old she is.
She turned 100 this year. Yeah.
And she was like so with it, Leo. I mean,
Really?
it's incredible. Like,
It's lucky you got that, because we're losing so much of that generation, so much of that knowledge. So I'm really glad projects like this exist, is because every day we're losing that. Every day we're losing that history of our own people.
well, I mean, we're so grateful that you took the time today, and I feel like, you know, this is where the Library Congress wants to capture certainly the stories that Charlie just told you about, but they really also want to capture people of your generation as well. And you'll have a file created, and you'll be able to add to it. So this doesn't have to be a one-time interview, but if you ever, you know, wanted to add other family stories or memorabilia, you know, this is not only about World War II. It really is to pull forward to the present also.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Anything else you'd like to share while we're here? It's up to you.
No, I really wanted to do this in addition to, you know, maintaining those oral traditions that my family at times were good about and then worse about maintaining. The stories you get from this generation of veterans really focus on Iraq and Afghanistan, and those are incredible stories. And if you guys want some recommendations for some folks that I know who were Notre Dame vets who fought in Iraq and Afghanistan, I can absolutely point you in that direction. But I wanted to make sure the story got told of the guys I served with, you know, the people I served with on these advisor teams, the guys who I was in Mexico with, who were really making an impact in the drug war down there in parts of the world that people don't talk about. A lot of the stories I would tell people, they didn't realize we had troops in some of these countries. And I want to make sure that the people I served with, their stories don't get lost, that people remember, like, yeah, we had people who really sacrificed in places like Mexico and Africa and all over the world. And I want to make sure that those stories continue just as much as the stories about Iraq and Afghanistan.
And it's interesting that you say that, 'cause I think you're right. Most of the people we've met have kind of been in that part of the world. Is there anything particularly in Mexico and around narcotics that you'd like to share an experience, or a specific person maybe that you served with? And we could come back and talk about that topic again if there's something right now.
That's a tough one, because I was part of about a 10-year-old mission there in Mexico. And I'm hesitant to share names, because a lot of the names of the people who were involved in the program for a long time, especially from the beginning, are still in a pretty sensitive position. But it was built from the ground up from a conversation between the Commandant of the U.S. Marines and the Commandant of the Mexican Marines at a Marine Leaders of the Americas conference one year. And they got together and said, we need to do something about the narcotic trafficking, about the violence happening down in Mexico. And they forged this relationship. And the relationship between Marines on each side of the border has, you know, it went on for over a decade before the most recent Mexican president decided to pull the Marines off of border duty. So we get down there, and there are not only facilities and training plans set up, but there's a cadre of Mexican Marines who had been hardened combat veterans before they even got involved with us, who had now spent almost 10 years working with the U.S. Marines and were fully integrated into our program. And the things they had done down there just completely changed the drug war. We used to talk about the Zetas cartel being a big, impactful thing down in Mexico. Because of what happened between the Zetas and the Mexican Marines, the Zetas got marginalized down to a small portion of the country, whereas they used to control most of the border with the United States. The Mexican Marines started a blood feud with them, and that continued for a long time. It probably still continues to this day. I haven't been there for a while, but they completely marginalized the Zetas into a small area of the country. And those Mexican Marines are just incredible. You hear these stories about, like, the cartels will fight against the police, the cartels will fight against the army, but the cartels will not fight the Marines. And that was the stories that we had heard going into the country. But that changed in the first few months I was there. So we get word one night that there's been an attack up on the border where we're sending people to, and we start getting information kind of slowly filter in. What had happened was a a cartel up there had set an ambush for the Mexican Marines running the patrols on the border. When the ambush happened, they activated a reaction force from that same base. The reaction force goes out and the reaction force gets ambushed. So they call up another reaction force, kind of an ad hoc force that gets thrown together by people in another base nearby. That base sends out a reaction force and that gets ambushed just outside their own gate. So this cartel had decided on that one night that instead of letting the Marines do their thing and trying to snipe at them from the shadows, they were going to actively go after the Marines. So in one night, it was a shift from, well, we're up there and we're chasing them around, kind of having our way up on the border, and the cartels are only surviving up there because they avoid us, to we are now in a dogfight with these cartels up there. And we got some message. I got a message from my team leader that, like, the gloves are off, make sure this doesn't happen again. And I worked with some incredible Mexican officers who they sat down with me like, all right, so here's what I want to do. Here's what we need. What can you support from the United States perspective? I said, well, we can support this way. We still need the program office is still going to demand this of us, but we can change some things around to make sure we get these guys the training that they need to not lose any more of these firefights. And one of my proudest, accomplishments while I was in the Marines is we didn't lose any more firefights while I was there. And we sent people up to the border, and the benefit of being a military advisor is I would get to sit at the pool bar over at the local hotel on the weekends, sipping pina coladas, getting reports in from the border, just won another firefight. We just really take it to the enemy. Like, all right, good job, guys. I'll have another pina colada.
Yeah, great story. I didn't really know too much about, the military, fight with the cartel. And that's really interesting.
A lot of it is an authorities thing. So in the United States, we don't do a lot of counter narcotics military operations because we consider narcotics trafficking a law enforcement issue. So even when I was working with U.S. Southern Command, a lot of our counter narcotics work had to be done through the Coast Guard, because the Coast Guard carries with them law enforcement authorities. So I got to work with a lot of really incredible Coast Guard officers and Coast Guardsmen when I was down there. But in other countries, specifically in Mexico, they don't draw that distinction. So the Mexican Marines got to do a lot of counter narcotic work that we wouldn't usually get to do.
That makes sense. So the lead kind of came from the way their government was structured, or the way the Marines there could have a maybe broader scope. Okay.
Exactly.
All right. Well, thank you so much for your service. Again, if there's anything else you'd like to add, feel free, but I think we've pretty much gone through the timeline. So.
All right. Yeah. Thank you guys for doing this. This is a great thing to do.